The Young and the Restless Spoilers. The night in Los Angeles was cloaked in a suffocating quiet, the kind of silence that carried menace instead of peace, as if the air itself knew that something dark was about to unfold. Within that stillness, a storm was brewing in the shadowed corridors of the hospital where Noah Newman lay unconscious, hovering between life and death after the mysterious fall that had left his family in anguish and the Newman empire trembling. The doctors called it a tragic accident, the police labeled it suspicious, but those who truly understood the world of power and vengeance that surrounded the Newmans knew it was neither random nor accidental. It was an act orchestrated with precision, and the man behind it was finally coming to light. Mitch had arrived. He wasn't a man easily defined by conscience or remorse, he was a predator wearing the mask of civility, a contract killer who had spent years blending into society under false names, changing jobs, identities, and faces as easily as someone changing coats. But Los Angeles wasn't just another city to him, it was a stage for something personal. The moment he heard Victor Newman had landed in town, a dangerous spark ignited within him. To men like Mitch, reputation was a challenge, not a deterrent. Victor's power, his control over the people around him, only made Mitch more determined to strike. He saw Noah not simply as a target but as a gateway into the Newman family's deepest vulnerability, a way to send a message not through threats or negotiations but through pain and irreversible loss. Inside the hospital, layers of security wrapped around Noah's room like an invisible fortress. Cops guarded the entrances, nurses rotated shifts with military precision, and every visitor was screened and logged. Yet Mitch, with his unnerving patience, had been studying every movement, every routine, every weak link. For days, he watched from a distance, disguised among the orderlies, memorizing the timing of security patrols, the layout of cameras, the shadows where he could vanish if spotted. He waited not out of hesitation but out of respect for precision. In his mind, this was an art death delivered with the quiet elegance of inevitability. He knew one mistake could cost him everything, but he also knew he had come too far to turn back. The danger wasn't only from Victor or the police. If Noah woke up, everything would crumble. The boy had seen his face. Noah's memories could unravel the entire operation, connecting the dots between the accident and the man who engineered it. Mitch understood the rule of survival in his world: never leave witnesses breathing. When the hospital's night shift began, Mitch made his move. His disguise was flawless, a stolen physician's badge, a white coat pressed to perfection, and a mask that hid not only his identity but the cold satisfaction in his expression. He walked down the dim corridor like he belonged there, each step measured, each glance timed to match the casual rhythm of exhausted staff. The faint hum of machines filled the background, blending with the echo of his footsteps. Behind Noah's door, life was reduced to a fragile line on a monitor, a heartbeat fighting through sedation and pain. Mitch stood there for a moment, studying the man who had unknowingly become his unfinished work. There was no hatred in his eyes, no emotion at all, just purpose. He pulled a syringe from his pocket, the contents shimmering faintly under the sterile light. It wasn't poison in the traditional sense. It was a neurotoxin, one that would mimic a natural heart failure, a substance designed to leave little trace but immense suffering. He injected it with steady hands, watching the young man's body tense in response. For Mitch, it was a silent triumph. For Noah, it was agony. An invisible fire ripping through his veins, twisting his body in pain though his mind was trapped somewhere between sleep and consciousness. But fate, unpredictable as ever, had other plans that night. Nick Newman had been restless. He couldn't shake the gnawing fear that something wasn't right. He had insisted on staying close to his brother's room, pacing the corridor like a guard dog, every nerve on alert. The sound of a muffled alarm, barely perceptible at first, snapped him into motion. He burst through the door just in time to see the masked figure hovering over Noah's trembling form. Rage ignited before thought could catch up. In that instant, Nick wasn't the composed businessman or loyal son, he was pure instinct, driven by blood and fury. He lunged at the intruder, tackling Mitch to the ground with the kind of force that came from desperation. The syringe clattered to the floor, the toxins spilling across the tiles as chaos erupted. Mitch fought back with trained precision, but Nick's anger was feral and unrelenting. The two men crashed into equipment, overturning trays, shattering glass, the sterile calm of the hospital shattered by the violent sound of struggle. Doctors and nurses rushed in, alarms blaring, and chaos unfolded like wildfire. While two guards restrained Mitch, Nick barely noticed his knuckles bleeding from the impact. His focus was fixed on Noah, whose monitors were screaming warnings. The medical team swarmed the bed, calling out vitals, trying to stabilize the collapsing heart rate. The image burned into Nick's mind, his brother convulsing, the line on the monitor jerking wildly before flattening. He felt his soul split apart in that moment, a helplessness that clawed at his chest as doctors shouted orders and rolled the bed toward the emergency room. For a terrifying instant, Nick thought he'd lost him. But amidst the flashing lights and frantic voices, Noah's heart found a faint rhythm again. The doctors worked relentlessly, their faces pale but determined, as they rushed him to intensive care. Mitch, pinned to the floor and handcuffed, remained eerily calm. There was no panic, no plea, no regret. His silence was his weapon, it was as if he knew something the rest didn't. The officers dragged him away, but his eyes lingered on Nick with a look that was neither defeat nor fear, it was warning. And that look, small as it was, sent chills down Nick's spine. He realized this wasn't the end of something, it was the beginning of a larger nightmare. Mitch wasn't just a lone assassin, he was a messenger of a deeper force, someone's hired hand in a war that hadn't even been declared yet. As the hours passed, the hospital became a war zone of emotion. Victor Newman arrived before dawn, his expression a mask of restrained fury. The sight of his grandson nearly dying again ignited an anger that few had seen since the old battles of Genoa City's past. He ordered extra security, private investigators, and began making calls that stretched beyond the reach of the police. For Victor, this wasn't just about justice, it was personal vengeance. He wanted to know who sent Mitch, who had dared touch his family again, and he would dismantle every empire, every ally, every facade until the answer was his. Meanwhile, Sienna Bacall's world was collapsing in another corner of the city. The news of her husband's arrest reached her like a thunderclap. She had always known Mitch had secrets, but she had convinced herself they were buried in the past: debts, violence, maybe a few broken laws. But the revelation that he was the one responsible for Noah's near death, and that he had been living as a professional killer all along, shattered her illusions. The guilt of silence weighed on her. She remembered moments, odd phone calls, trips at strange hours, the subtle shifts in his behavior, things she had dismissed as paranoia. Now, each memory stabbed like a blade. Noah, still unconscious, became the fragile thread that tied everyone's fate together. His survival determined not only whether Mitch would face murder charges but whether the truth behind the entire plot would surface. If he woke, he could expose the network, the motives, the real enemy behind Mitch's orders. If he didn't, the Newman family would be left chasing shadows. Nick refused to leave his side, while Sharon spent her nights praying and Victor made promises of retribution. The family that had weathered decades of betrayal and tragedy was once again standing on the edge of another war, one that threatened to rip apart not just their empire, but their very souls. In the days that followed, whispers spread across Genoa City and Los Angeles alike. The name Mitch Bacall began surfacing in confidential reports, linked to unsolved crimes and discreet assassinations across the years. The deeper Victor's investigators dug, the clearer it became that Mitch wasn't acting alone. His connections reached into corporations, hidden accounts, and even rival families that had long held grudges against the Newmans. Every revelation deepened the mystery, every lead raised the stakes. And through it all, Noah remained in critical condition, a symbol of both survival and danger. But in the silence of the hospital room, where machines hummed softly and the scent of antiseptic filled the air, there was movement. Noah's hand twitched, his eyelids flickered, and somewhere deep in his mind, the memories began to resurface: the fall, the confrontation, the man in the shadows, and the cold eyes watching him before the darkness took over. The truth wasn't gone, it was waiting. And when Noah opened his eyes again, the storm that Mitch thought he could control would erupt into something much larger, a reckoning that would reach every corner of Genoa City and expose every alliance built on lies. Because in the young and the restless, survival is never the end. It's the prelude to vengeance. And this time, the Newmans were not just defending their legacy, they were preparing for war. The chaos in Noah Newman's hospital room erupted like an explosion of sound and fury, breaking the sterile silence that had reigned for days. The moment Mitch Bacall stepped out of the shadows, he was no longer hiding behind the illusion of stealth, he had chosen to make his move in plain sight. Disguised in a white coat and a surgeon's mask, he entered as if he belonged, his cold confidence cutting through the air like a blade. To him, invisibility was no longer necessary, the plan had changed. Noah's pulse was steady but weak, and time was running out before the Newman family reasserted control over every inch of the hospital. Mitch's fingers trembled only slightly as he gripped the syringe, its contents glowing faintly under the fluorescent lights. Inside was Tetra 5, a synthetic neurotoxin designed for covert assassinations, a substance that paralyzed the respiratory system, induced cardiac arrest, and left almost no trace detectable by conventional toxicology. It was a weapon favored by mercenaries and covert agencies, banned under every international law but traded in black markets for those willing to pay in blood. Mitch had used it before, on politicians, on traitors, on those who thought they could outlive their sins, but never with such personal satisfaction. He wanted Victor Newman's empire to crumble, and watching his grandson die in front of him was the first step. Yet the instant he plunged the needle into Noah's arm, the world shattered around him. The monitors began to scream, the heart rate spiking and then dipping violently. Noah's body convulsed as the toxin surged through his veins, and within seconds, he was gasping soundlessly for air, his body seizing under the invisible weight of chemical death. Mitch's expression remained calm until the door burst open. Nick Newman's voice, raw and furious, broke through the corridor before his body followed. He saw the masked figure hunched over his son's bed, the syringe glinting in his hand, and instinct overtook reason. He lunged forward with the force of a man possessed, his body colliding with Mitch's in a crash of fury and adrenaline. The impact threw the syringe to the floor, its needle snapping as the remaining toxin pooled across the tiles. Mitch tried to roll away, but Nick's rage pinned him to the ground. The father's fists came down in a blur of motion, one after another, fueled by horror, disbelief, and primal instinct. He screamed at him, his voice cracking under the weight of terror, "Who are you? Why would you try to kill my son? What kind of monster are you?" His words echoed through the sterile hall, summoning nurses and guards from every direction. But Mitch only laughed. It was a low, chilling sound that didn't belong in a hospital. He spat blood and grinned through swollen lips, whispering words that sent ice down Nick's spine, "I'll kill your whole family." The sentence hung in the air like a curse, heavy and real, as if death itself had spoken. Nick froze for a moment, staring into the eyes of a man who looked back with nothing but hunger for destruction. He couldn't comprehend it, there was no vendetta, no rivalry, no motive that made sense. Mitch was a ghost from nowhere, and yet he spoke as if the Newmans had signed his death warrant years ago. Before Nick could process the madness, the sound of sirens filled the hallways. Security guards swarmed the room, guns drawn, shouting orders. Mitch tried to move, lunging for the broken syringe, but Nick shoved him back hard enough to knock the air out of his lungs. Within seconds, 2 officers pinned him to the floor, wrenching his arms behind his back and slapping cold steel cuffs over his wrists. Mitch didn't resist, he simply smirked as if capture was part of his design. The room was chaos. Nurses shouted vitals, the code blue alarm wailed, and the crash cart arrived as Noah's monitors flatlined. Doctors rushed him out toward the emergency operating room, his limp body disappearing behind swinging doors as Nick stumbled back, covered in his son's blood and the remnants of a nightmare he still couldn't understand. His ears rang, his heart pounded, and all he could see was that smile, that deranged look in Mitch's eyes that promised more to come. The police dragged Mitch upright, but even in handcuffs, he seemed to radiate control. "You can't stop it," he murmured to no one in particular, his voice low and deliberate. "You think this ends with me?" The officers shoved him toward the exit, unaware that his words weren't just empty threats. Somewhere beyond the walls of that hospital, there were others, people waiting for signals, for confirmation, for chaos to begin. Mitch was just the first move in a much larger game. Inside the ER, Noah's fight for life became a desperate race against time. The doctors recognized signs of chemical interference almost immediately but couldn't identify the compound. His body was convulsing from the effects of the toxin, the paralysis spreading fast. They pumped him full of stabilizers, ventilated his lungs, and began emergency dialysis in an attempt to flush the poison from his bloodstream. The hospital director called Victor and Sharon, while Nick stood outside the emergency room window, numb and shaking. His hands still trembled from the confrontation, his knuckles bruised and bloodied, but his mind refused to rest. He replayed every second in his head, the sound of Noah's heartbeat fading, the deranged laugh, the venomous promise. He knew he'd seen pure evil that night, something beyond rational human intent. And when Victor arrived minutes later, fury radiating from his presence like a living storm, Nick could only point toward the locked-down wing and whisper, "He said he'd kill all of us." The interrogation began before dawn. Mitch sat in a holding cell, the flickering fluorescent light casting a pale halo around his calm expression. Despite being restrained, he exuded confidence, as if his arrest was a temporary inconvenience. The detectives bombarded him with questions: "Who hired you? Why target Noah? What's your connection to the Newmans?" But he only smiled, occasionally humming as if the chaos he caused was music to him. It was Nick who finally broke into the room, ignoring protocol, slamming his hands on the table with the fury of a father stripped of answers. "Why?" he demanded again, voice raw with desperation. "Why my son?" Mitch met his gaze, unflinching, his smile widening. "Because your family thinks it owns everything," he said slowly, his voice almost a whisper. "But soon, you'll learn what it means to lose everything." His words weren't just threats, they were declarations, like a man reciting scripture. Then, just as suddenly, his expression darkened. He leaned forward slightly, eyes glinting with malice. "And tell your father," he said, almost taunting, "the debt has come due." Those words would haunt Nick for days. He didn't understand them then, but Victor did the moment he heard them. Somewhere deep in his past, buried beneath deals, enemies, and betrayals long forgotten, there had been a man connected to the name Bacall, someone Victor had ruined, someone whose family had been left with nothing. Mitch's father, perhaps, or his employer. The ghosts of old wars were returning, and this time they were striking through bloodlines. Meanwhile, Noah clung to life. The doctors managed to stabilize his heart, but the toxin's damage was extensive. They kept him in a medically induced coma, hoping his body would recover enough to fight back. Sharon never left his bedside, and Nick, torn between rage and guilt, began vowing to uncover every thread of the conspiracy. The more he learned, the darker it became. Mitch wasn't a random killer but part of a hired network that had ties to financial institutions, rival corporations, and silent investors with grudges against Newman Enterprises. And the order to kill Noah wasn't about money, it was about vengeance. Days later, as Mitch awaited transfer to a federal facility, something went wrong. The power in the holding area flickered. Alarms blared. When the guards checked his cell, it was empty. The door had been tampered with, security footage wiped clean. He had vanished without a trace. Nick received the call just as Noah's condition took a turn for the worse. Panic surged through him as the reality sank in. Mitch was free again, and his promise still echoed in Nick's mind. "I'll kill your whole family." From that night forward, the Newman family lived under constant guard. Victor tightened security, Sharon and Nick remained by Noah's side, and the shadow of Mitch Bacall became a specter that haunted every corner of Genoa City. But what none of them yet realized was that Mitch's disappearance wasn't escape, it was the next step in a calculated plan. He hadn't failed, he had merely begun. Because the toxin in Noah's body wasn't meant just to kill, it was meant to send a message. It was rare, almost impossible to trace, but not entirely unfamiliar to those who understood corporate warfare in its darkest form. And when Victor learned the name Tetra 5, he froze. It was a weapon developed years ago by a private security firm linked to one of his old rivals. Someone out there had resurrected an old war Victor thought was buried forever, and now they were using his family as the battlefield. Noah's body trembled faintly under the machines, his heart beating weakly but persistently. Somewhere deep inside, his subconscious flickered with memory, the fall, the figure in the dark, the sound of metal against rock. The truth was rising like a tide he could no longer suppress. And when he woke, if he woke, the world would never be the same again. Because Mitch Bacall wasn't just a man. He was a weapon forged by hatred, and his war against the Newmans had only just begun.